Okay, everyone, so this video is about tefillah. And when I say it's about tefillah, this is the kind of topic that there's like a few parts you really need to sort of talk about, and they're a little bit controversial. So here's the thing about the whole tefillah problem. No one seems like they're really doing very much of it. I don't know how to say that in a less blunt way, and if you've been watching my videos or if you know me at all, you know that in general, I don't like things that are beating around the bush or vague or undefined or unclear. And there's really the reason why is because you can't really deal with any kind of problem that you have in any area if you're not clear on what exactly the problem is and where it's coming from and how it's structured and why it's happening. And so with the tefillah topic, that's really, I think, a massive, massive example of that type of problem. Now, just to sort of put this out there, exactly what the problem is and where it sort of how old it is, where it comes from. The problem seems to be, at least, and I'm really describing right now, it's more true in countries that are not Israel, but it's also true in Israel. And the difference is language, because outside of Israel, people are speaking much less Hebrew. But the problem is that whatever tefillah is, people are really struggling to do it, get something out of it, find meaning or value in it, or understanding what its purpose even is. And that's like a funny thing, because this is a very old thing, and it's a very specific kind of thing, and yet it's really just not functioning. And the weird thing about it is that it hasn't been functioning for like a pretty long time. Like if you look in the some of the halacha books, like the poskim talk about how the people for already many centuries have actually not been able to do tefillah in a way that was really particularly effective. And so I'm just going to sort of tell you what I'm seeing, and then we'll try to talk about what exactly the problem is and where it's coming from. And what I see is just a lot of people who, and I work right now primarily with people who would label themselves, they want to use some kind of label system as like Orthodox, modern Orthodox Jews. These are like convenient labels to help us sort of figure out where we're standing, but it doesn't take us much further than that. And so, but I have a lot of exposure and a lot of encounters with people of really every kind of, every brand, if you want, every label of what we call Judaism today. And I think, like, from what I see and what I've seen in my own life, this problem is pervasive. And again, the fact that it already existed a few hundred years ago and even before that sort of shows this is not particular to any, label or version of Jewish expression, whatever you want to call these different labels. These labels are problematic by themselves because they are largely pretty meaningless, but we are not going to have so much time to go into that part in this video. But the issue with tefillah is that it's usually translated as prayer, and there's just not a lot of it really happening, because when people are trying to engage in prayer and they're asking God for things, so it's a kind of thing that people really, I think, are struggling with making that real. I'll tell you what I've seen a lot of. So first, what I see a lot of is there's a lot of talk about trying to just internalize the ideas of prayer, how much you need God to give you things that you have in your life, and how much if you just work on it and you really try, you'll get there. And you have to really realize how special prayer is and how important it is. And these are like really big deal types of things. And it's really wrong that people don't do it well or don't do it right. And there's a lot of that type of speech and descriptions. And then there's on the other side, you have sometimes people will say, well, we understand it's very hard for people not to engage in prayer because a lot of people have questions about if there even is a God and how do they even know, and people just don't connect to it. And it's also very repetitive because you look at what prayer is. Well, the traditional way of doing it is that you got to say the same words every day, 3 times a day, and that just seems very redundant. And so why are we even doing that? And so, these are some of the things that I've heard and seen. And, I go to different shuls, different synagogues, and I hear, different rabbis will speak about it. And sometimes they'll give very, more flexible perspectives. Like they'll sort of say, well, we understand how hard this is, and we realize that people are really struggling with this. Or you'll have rabbis who really give a lot of stronger pressure to sort of be like, well, don't you realize how important this is? It's a really big deal. And that's more of like, I don't say negative, but it's what's called musar, like more of a motivational type of discussion about prayer. And these are all the kinds of things that I see sort of thrown around a lot. And we're going to delve into some of them a little bit more carefully to sort of analyze what exactly is happening in them. But I just to sort of just put that there, all those different kinds of situations, I guess, that you really see a lot. I'm sure people who are watching this have seen that in their own lives and have heard rabbis speak about these things. And so I'm just going to share a few things that I think are kind of going on here and describe what the problem is and how it's kind of working. So There's two ingredients that are brought in the halacha that you have to have when you're engaging in what's called tefillah. And just keep in mind that I'm distinguishing now. We're going to talk about what tefillah means pretty carefully in a minute. But the two ingredients that are described are you have to know who you're talking to, and you have to also know the meaning of the words that you are saying. So that's just what you have to have in order for tefillah to even be operational. Now, let's just analyze that carefully for a second. These two ingredients, you have to know who you're talking to, and you have to know what the words that you're saying actually mean. So if you think about that, kind of like just without getting into like a kind of like a religious or halachic perspective, like these are the halachic requirements of the Jewish lifestyle of how you have to do tefillah. So like just think about that very normally for a second as a regular person. And you think about that carefully, normally. So those two ingredients are just the background requirements for any conversation that you want to have with another self, another person. So in other words, if you're talking to somebody else, so you have to know you're talking to somebody, and you have to know what it is that you're saying. If either of those two ingredients are lacking, then there is no conversation. And there's just nothing happening between the two people. So if I'm kind of just not aware that I'm talking to somebody, I'm just kind of making sounds. Just kind of like a funny example now that I'm recording this, for YouTube. So right now I'm just talking to a camera, but I have in my imagination that there are people on the other side of this camera. So that's how I'm able to do this. And I'm thinking kind of carefully about what it is that I'm saying to those people, to you guys. And that's because those are the two ingredients that are required for there to be some kind of bridging between me and you. Now, when you say it that way, so some people will then walk away from that set of thoughts and sort of be like, oh, so that sounds like maybe prayer, tefillah is supposed to be a conversation. And the thing is, I'm not really saying that, if you think about it a little more carefully, because I'm going a little deeper than that. Let's just think for a second, what exactly is a conversation? A conversation is where there's two selves, and I'm over here, somehow shining through this body, and the word for the self that's shining through is the word neshama, but we'll leave that aside for a different time. And so I'm kind of like just trying to reach out using sounds and using my mind to sort of channel the sounds out into the world where there's air. The air is vibrating with the sounds. That's how sound works. It vibrates the air. And then your ears are able to pick up the vibrations, translate them into perceptions of words, and that goes into your mind, and then you, the self, encounter my ideas through those words, and you get a sense of me through those tools. It's like two selves that are using this bridging mechanism of sound waves in literally the ocean of sound that's around us, and it vibrating that ocean, and that's how I can extend myself across the way to you. So that's what conversations are. Now, just to think about that a little more carefully for a second, well, when you sort of take that in terms of our context, it takes it away from just sort of this new simplification of like, oh, well, it just sounds like now prayer is a conversation. Like, I just want you to sort of keep in mind for a second those different concepts. Like, we had now those two ingredients that you have to have in order to create tefillah, and then now we have like what exactly is happening for real in a conversation. It's the two selves that are sort of like where I'm the intangible self, the me that is sort of using the set of tools to reach across the gap and get to you, and you on the other end, on the other side, who are like also kind of somehow beyond your body, receiving it through your body, and we are able to sort of connect the two cells, what we call some kind of connection or relationship through that process. So let's just dig a little more deeply into that in terms of what we mean when we say tefillah. See, the problem with the ideas here of tefillah as prayer is that it doesn't work, but the reason why it doesn't work is because if you kind of look carefully at the structure of how our minds operate, so we can't have a conversation with another person that we don't perceive in some way. In other words, there has to be a basic perception of selfhood on the other end of an interaction before I can actually operate externally in a way that expresses that perception. So think about that pretty carefully for 1 second. The whole way that you behave, the way that you act on the outside, the way that you feel in your emotional state, and the kinds of thoughts that you think, all three of those things all emanate from your perceptions. In other words, according to whatever you perceive reality to be in a given situation, so to that, in that exact light, the light of that perception, you will have corresponding thoughts that essentially express whatever that perception is. You'll also have corresponding feelings that emanate from the thoughts and the perceptions, and you'll also behave externally in a way that is an expression naturally in alignment with those underlying perceptions. So if we're going to say here that you have to actually know who it is you are speaking to, and then you have to think about the meaning of what you're saying, so you can't really fake that, because the whole structure of the way you're designed is perceptions lead to thoughts, lead to feelings and then are expressed as words. And so that that structure is something which is built into how you're designed. And by the way, when the Torah and the Gemara and all these sources that talk about tefillah or prayer, so whenever they describe the process of tefillah, so they are all working with that structure, because that structure is a Torah structure. The Torah describes how you are designed in that exact way. Yourself uses a set of tools that are stacked. So the stack of the tools is there's a self that's at the top of the stack, and then when it's kind of like trying to shine itself out into the world, it goes through a set of glasses called perceptions. Those perceptions lead to thoughts, and those thoughts then lead to feelings, and those feelings lead to actions. If you think carefully about all of that whole stack, you'll realize pretty quickly that it explains a lot of things about how our feelings work and how our thoughts work, because again, the way that the root of the way that you think about someone else, for example, is it's essentially how you perceive them. So there's no way to really separate out these things and sort of try to have a perception of one thing, and then you sort of have, on the other hand, you have thoughts that are like different from that perception. So when you take that stack structure for a second and you sort of conceive it and just think about it a little bit. So, and there's plenty to think about there. So I would recommend you just think about that by itself for a few minutes. But if we just take that stack for a second, it makes a lot of sense why people would have a very hard time actually experiencing something called prayer and feel like they actually are doing something when they do davening or tefillah or whatever. Because if you don't actually have any real perception of another self, of what we call Hashem, in your core, so then you can't fake the thoughts and the feelings and the actions that would come from that. You can't fake those things. Like, the way that you see reality is the way that you are going to be in reality. So what's funny about that is like the discussions usually about tefillah are about like how you have to really just work on it, or if you just cared about it more, you'd realize how important it is. But like, there's an actual mechanical problem in the whole tefillah process, which is that if you don't actually have any perception of Hashem, so then you cannot pretend to talk to Hashem. And then take that a little bit further. Let's say instead of having no perception of Hashem, you have some kind of perception. Let's say you have a perception of Hashem that like there's some guy in the sky who's watching you, and he's really, he created the world and he's taking care of stuff in some vague way. Well, here's another interesting phenomenon that comes out of that. Like we said, according to your perception, so too will be your thoughts in alignment with that perception. And according to that perception and those thoughts, you will then have a corresponding set of emotional results or feelings that come from that. So that's just like, if you view somebody as benevolent and caring about you. So let's say you have a parent, and your perception of them is that they are always there for you and they care for you, and that's how you see them. And you have all these experiences in your life with them that reinforce that, and that you see how that really plays out in reality. So then, of course, you'll have thoughts that are more positive towards them. You'll think about how great they are, and you'll have issues when something happens to them, and like you'll struggle with the feelings of sadness, and you'll also have, like those, and again, those thoughts and those perceptions will also bleed into an actual emotional response where you'll actually feel physiological sensations of positivity, excitement when they're coming to see you, or and you'll feel physiological sensations of sadness if something, God forbid, happens to one of them. That's like a direct result. But if your perception is very different from that, and you perceive them as someone who is fundamentally disinterested in you, so then all those things will be very different. And what's really interesting is to contrast those two situations. Like, well, what if you initially perceive someone one way, and then suddenly, like in the drop of a hat, you suddenly see them in a completely different way. Like, you thought one thing about them, and then suddenly it's revealed that it's not the same way. So that happens sometimes. Let's say, as an example, someone who finds out after many years that they're actually adopted. So suddenly the way they perceive their parent is drastically shifted in an instant. And now the types of thoughts they have about their parent, the way they see them changed. So the thoughts they think will change, and the way they feel towards them will also change. And for each one, it will be a little bit different depending on exactly what kind of perceptual shift takes place, and then what kind of thought pattern will then devolve from that, emanate from that. And so what that kind of shows is it's not like an on-off thing, like you either have a perception of God or you don't. It's that according to the way that you perceive Hashem in your own sense of perception, so to that, in that exact corresponding way, you will have thoughts and feelings that devolve and emanate directly from that. And so that kind of leads us to a very clear mechanical framework for the problem of what's going on in tefillah in the world now, which is, and not just now, for quite a long time already, which is that you can't force yourself to think things and to feel things if you don't actually see things in that way perceptually. And so here with Hashem, the problem is that no one's really, I mean, in my experience just growing up, I'm 37 now. And I went through many, many years of Jewish school and yeshiva and learning and teaching and back and forth. And I just don't see very many people talking about this. I mean, in my life, and I've met hundreds of teachers. In my life, I think I know maybe 5 teachers who have, 2 of whom have actually identified this problem directly. And the other 3, I mean, they reference it in some kind of oblique way, but it's not anywhere near as clear as it could be. And that's a huge problem because, like, if we're trying to get people, as me as a teacher, if I want to get people to actually engage in tefillah, and I'm not aware of what the problem is and how it's structured, I mean, there's no way to solve that. It's just like that's like a structural issue. And forget as a teacher, like I'm a person, like I happen to work as a teacher right now, and like when I first was growing up and I was like trying to get, into davening, when everyone kept telling me you gotta get into davening. Davening is an important thing to do. And I was just like, okay. And then they teach you like you gotta move like this, or people will tell you things like you just gotta have more kavanah, which is like the Hebrew word for something, which usually translated as intent. But like that's not particularly helpful because again, to just tell someone to do that without addressing the underlying mechanics of how that works is like it leads to this very haphazard random result. Like some people might just kind of feel relatively okay about tefillah, and so they just kind of keep doing it. Some people might hate it. Some people are bored by it. Some people have all kinds of different associations as their life unfolds. They have times where they like it more, times where they hate it more. And it's like that whole thing is a chaotic, haphazard situation, which is like, it doesn't have to be like that. There's a specific setup here that's going on, which if we just address it and talk about it clearly and directly, then I think it's something which is, I mean, just like any problem in life, you can solve it if you can understand it. You might not be able to solve it overnight and just make it like switch from this to that, but like you can learn what to do to make something better than what it was before when you understand it. And so that's really what I think is a huge issue and the underlying problem really with tefillah. And so, so that's the structure of the problem. And, when we talk about those 2 ingredients, you got to know who you're talking to and you got to know what you're saying. And then I was saying it's like really about just having like a real conversation. So the reason why I put that out as the backdrop is because when you are dealing with Hashem and you have no awareness of what your perception of Hashem even is, or you have some awareness of it, but it's like, or let's say you think your perception of Hashem is a certain kind of way, and let's say you are correct. Let's say you perceive Hashem as some guy in the sky. So then, accordingly, will be your experience of tefillah. That's like a significant point to understand that just like with another person, you got to sort of know who you're talking to and know what you're saying to them. So with Hashem also, if you want to even get anywhere in this whole space that we call tefillah, you got to have those parts. That's really, and it's exactly the same type of thing. So essentially, I think that's the problem. If we can sort of like just have that clearly, described in that way. And the question really comes then like, well, how do you solve a problem like that? So I'm going to make a crazy argument. I'm going to describe what I think is I don't think it's an easy solution. I think it's a very simple solution though. And that's a pretty significant distinction. And so I think in order to understand it, we have to do 2 things. We just need to define what exactly tefillah is. So tefillah, the word tefillah, the root is the word palal, and this is a pretty well-known point. I've heard this taught in different places. People like this point to sort of realize that the word tefillah is more profound than just prayer, which is some kind of vague Christian word that you're asking God to give you things. Tefillah, the actual underlying meaning really is about alignment. In other words, if you think about yourself, and this is a much longer discussion, but just for our purposes right now, if you think about yourself as sort of operating on 2 levels, there's like your sense of yourself, that we call again just so you have perceptions of others, you also have perceptions of your own self. That's called your self-image. So you'll have your own sense of self, of who you are and the way you think about yourself and the way you feel about yourself. And then there's like the real you, like the higher consciousness you, like the more you, that's kind of like a little bit out of reach, but that you're constantly growing more and more in touch with. In other words, every time that you learn something about yourself or you grow in some way, you mature more. So what we really mean when we say that is that now you're kind of like expanding your perception of yourself to more accurately match the truth about your real self, because we don't really know ourselves fully. We're constantly learning more and more and more about ourselves. And so what you're doing is you are expanding your awareness and knowledge of yourself, but yourself is already pre-existing. There's like the total you, and then there's like the awareness that you have. And every time that you get a little more aware of yourself, that's what we call growth. And so tefillah is the process of going inside yourself, trying to let's even give a little more background for a second. If you want to actually engage in that process of growth, there's really two there's two main ways, I guess you could say, that you could do that. So or two parts really. One of the parts is you do actions in your life which help you reveal to yourself things about yourself that you didn't know. So, for example, if you are in a conversation with somebody and, let's say they're being a little bit bullying and you've always been a little bit more shy or nervous with other people, and you're able to sort of stand up for yourself in a very, unusual way, you'll have now learned something more about your capacity because, like, part of, like, you actually have more ability to be assertive than you are currently aware of. Now, that ability was always there. It was in potential. It was buried inside, but it was there. And so now what you did was you suddenly discovered it. And it's like you suddenly develop awareness of that which was already there. So in that situation, you engage in an activity where you said something and you responded back. You didn't let yourself get bowled over by the other person. And that's really how you now, you uncovered that which was already underneath. So that's one part of it. And then, if you think about that carefully, there's the external side of it, which is like what you actually are doing. And then there's also the internal process in which suddenly your perception expands. And there is, there's many, many different tools you can use to create that kind of expansion of awareness. And those tools are all called, the word for them in Hebrew is the word mitzvah, poorly translated as commandment for a reason that we'll not get into right now. But the actual purpose of those tools is they are triggers that are designed to expand your awareness of yourself to include more of who you really are. So, and there's a lot of background to that, and there's tons more things to talk about, other videos, and we'll get to all of that. But the point right now is that that's what all the mitzvos are. But there's one particular mitzvah, one particular tool that is distinct from all the other ones. And whereas every other tool has two parts, it has an actual action side that you engage in on the outside, and there's also this internal process where you go in and you sort of you expand your perception as a corollary to the action that you're taking. So there's one mitzvah that is distinct from that, and that's a mitzvah where instead of having both parts, like an external action side of things and an internal process of expansion, so it only has the internal process of expansion aspect. And that mitzvah is tefillah. That's what it's called. It's called avodah shebalev. It means an internal effort. It's where you're basically doing some kind of process on the inside, and there is no external element to it that is inherent to it. In other words, you can try to use externals to try to help you do it, but the actual tefillah process, the word tefillah refers to the internal process of aligning your awareness more firmly or more broadly with the truth of who you really are. That's what the word tefillah actually means. And the word lahitpalel means to palal yourself, to now align yourself with your higher self. And so that's what you're trying to do. Now, again, you can take all kinds of actions in your life to try to create that kind of expansion of consciousness, but what we're also saying here is that there is a way to sort of do it without the actions, to just go directly into the self, sort of like pierce the inner space, and then see where you're at in terms of your perception of yourself, and then expand that to a much broader, to a higher state of awareness of who you really are. Now, we need to talk a little bit more at some point about like who you really are, because what that total you, we call the neshama, it's like the super neshama, the anochi of the neshama, and that's really where you start getting to like where Hashem is and what is nevuah, and there's a lot of things to talk about with that also. But just for right now, the point I am making is that if you want to actually fix the tefillah process for yourself and make it real, you have to understand, first of all, that tefillah is this internal process of trying to expand your perception of yourself to be more inclusive of more of yourself. That's what the process is actually about. So when you take that point and you then expand that a little further in terms of what we can do with that, so it gives us a little bit of room to sort of think about what it is that we're doing. So just as an example, we have something that we use nowadays called the sidur. And the sidur literally means the order. It's kind of like the order of things that you say, and every day when you're trying to do tefillah. So we very often, we call that davening and prayer. And the tricky thing about those terms and using them in this context is that they are very distracting. The term tefillah, the term davening, and the term prayer, they end up getting in the way because it's very confusing to hear someone describe tefillah the way I just described it, and then kind of be like, well, what about the siddur? So here is a crazy secret. The siddur is not tefillah. It is not tefillah at all. The siddur is a tool that you're supposed to be using to create tefillah if you can. In other words, there is a mitzvah to engage in tefillah at least once a day. And we have our approach to today, at least for men, and we can have a discussion about men and women, but for right now, for men, it's 3 times a day to engage in tefillah. Tefillah means to go inside yourself and find Hashem, to find the inner self that you are, and sort of expand your awareness of yourself to include more of who you really are, an internal growth process. And again, I fully recognize there's so much to talk about how to do that and what that means. But we got to start first with this point, which is that tefillah is that internal process. The siddur is not tefillah. The siddur is a tool that you use to try to create tefillah. They are words that you say. There's all kinds of different words that are going on in there, and they're designed to help you to actually access that process. But if you don't know that's the process that you're trying to access, and if you don't understand the tools, then they're just not going to do that for you. And so you'll just end up kind of feeling like a little bit off, bored, curious, unsure why you're even saying these things. Like you'll look around and see other people around you who are, which by the way is another question, why do we even do this in a group? But it's a longer discussion also. But you look around other people who are also using the siddur and look, that guy looks like, or that girl looks like they really know what they're doing. They look like they're really into it. I find this boring, or I don't understand this, and like that whole situation is complicated. And like it's complicated because it's just a tangle. Like you cannot expect to actually get anywhere with that process if you don't understand A, what it is that you're doing, like what tefillah actually is, and B, what the purpose of the siddur is. So these parts, they all need to be sort of clarified. And I think that once they get clarified, so then it opens the door to the next part of the conversation, which is now, okay, so fine. So that's what tefillah is. And like now I understand why I don't connect to it, because like I always thought tefillah was there's a guy in the sky that he's up there and I got to ask him for stuff. And now what you're telling me instead is that like that's all some kind of like Christian perspective or whatever, and like I can't even begin to talk to Hashem if I actually don't know anything about Hashem. So like these are like real problems. And then it's like, and you're also telling me the siddur is not even the way to do that, because the siddur is actually just a tool, and I have to learn how to use the siddur properly to even do that. And so really that kind of leads us to our conclusion points for this video. So that really comes down to this. In order for you to actually solve the tefillah problem for yourself, and in order for us as a community and as a nation to solve the tefillah problem for all of ourselves, whether it's in schools or just, it's really nothing to do with institutions. This is for people to figure out. You got to do a couple of things. Number one, you have to learn more about the other person in the relationship. In other words, if your perspective of God, what you call God, is a guy in the sky or nothing, or you're not sure about God, or any of those types of things, you are missing like hugely vital information that you need to get. Because like by the way, there is so much information about this. It's not like, and I don't mean like there's a lot of philosophical ideas and like, do we believe in God? Do we not? Can we prove God? Can we not? I'm talking about a qualitatively different set of ideas about who Hashem is, ideas that you can understand and that you can access and you can learn, and it's vastly different than just like some kind of vague thing like he's a guy in the sky and then you just gotta kind of figure out what you're going to do about that. Like we're talking about real ideas, and I'm going to be putting out more videos about this, and you can find other places to learn about these things. But the point is that like if you want to get somewhere with tefillah, you have to do that. There is no way around that. There's no like, well, I could just if we could just set up a good enough structure in our school or in our shul and like get people to stop talking, that'll make it better. Like that will not do anything, because it can make it like little short-term things, like maybe people will be a little quieter, which then could be for some people they could learn like 5 more words of the siddur, which will maybe get them somewhere, probably not. But like to get anywhere for real, you have to upgrade your actual awareness, your perception. Literally, the word your yira, which is what the word actually means, your awareness of the other self. You have to upgrade your awareness of the other self in the situation, and that's the only way to do it. You cannot fake thoughts and feelings about someone with whom you have no real awareness or perception or anything like that. There's just no way to fake that. So that's one thing you have to do. The second thing you have to do is you have to learn about how you are structured in terms of the inside, and like the way that your perceptions need to constantly be expanding to learn more about who you really are. And that's going to be directly correlated to your knowledge of Hashem, because the deepest side of who you are is directly linked to Hashem. So it's kind of like, that's just the way that those things just go together. And the third thing you got to do is you got to learn about the tools that we have, because to talk about the siddur in some kind of vague way and just like, well, you got to use a siddur, and like to be very attached to the siddur in a way that's just very rigid and fixed without any understanding of the siddur or the underlying principles we just described, it's not going to help anything. So you got to do those 3 things. You got to learn about Hashem, learn about how you're structured, and then learn about the actual siddur as a tool. You put those things together, that will solve the problem of tefillah that has been going on for like hundreds of years. And again, there have been people throughout history who figured out how to solve that problem, and each time those people did whatever they could to teach it and spread it, and like that's what I'm trying to do right now, just because I think that it's, in my life, it's been an incredible change, just understanding what Tefilla is. It literally upgraded my whole experience of it. But like, this is the kind of thing which is solvable. It does not need to be this thing where you're just kind of, you know, I had a teacher once who used to say, you have to wish, to want, to aspire, to hope, to maybe one day we'll actually care about this. Like, that, like, what kind of thing is that? Like, I have to one day maybe, like, it'll just happen? Like, that's not how life works. If you have things in your life that you would like to create in your life, you have to start to pay attention to them, figure them out, and then take steps to make them happen. If you don't do that, there's no reason to expect that it will work out that way. That's really what I think is underlying this whole, you know, just the purpose of this video, is to sort of start getting those ideas out there in a clear way. People can actually start to access them and realize there is a way to do this. There's a process, and you can learn that process. So I hope that was relatively clear. Yeah, think about all that, and in the next few videos, I hope to really expand on some of these points much more at length, and I'm looking forward to seeing you there.